Howdy, and welcome to another webinar from Tabletop Alliance. My name is Bruce Brown, and I'm the president of Tabletop Alliance. And if this is your first interaction with us, Tabletop Alliance is a 501c3 nonprofit here in the United States that's purpose is to develop and equip educators and community leaders to use games towards their outcomes. And so that means high school teachers, community college teachers, professors. If you are running a foster youth program, if you are doing community engagement, we want to help you really realize your outcomes by the use of games. And if you're already doing that, awesome, great job. We want to know about it and we want to connect all of you. So if you are doing any of those things or want to do those things, make sure to go on over to tabletopalliance.org and create a guild, because what that is we're going to be communicating with you and connecting you with other educators and community partners, as well as whenever possible, getting equipment to you through our relationships with publishers and designers and distributors, because we want to see more gaming in the classroom and in these different environments. And so today is one of those developmental sessions. So today we're going to be joined by Dustin Staats of Board Gaming with Education, who's going to be talking about gamifying your semester and gamifying your classroom experience. And so without further ado, I'm going to welcome Dustin, and he can jump right in and tell us a little bit more about himself. Hey, Dustin.
Hey, Bruce. Thanks for having me on. I'm excited.
I'm excited for you to be here. So can you educate everybody a little bit about yourself and your background?
Sure. Yeah. So, as a broad approach to my background, I am the owner of Board Game with Education. This is where we kind of share similar missions. So I'm excited to be here and chat more about this and really push for games for learning, games in the classroom, and those sorts of environments. So we started as a podcast, and now we are an online store. We develop learning resources to complement board games too. Um, and my background in teaching, most of my experience is teaching English as a second language. I do have other experience in after school programs, tutoring, consulting, and I studied my master's here in the States. Mostly, well, I guess now it's probably split even where I'm abroad teaching and then also back in the States working in programs here now. I think it's probably 5 and 5 years or 6 and 5 or something like that. Yeah. So then just maybe to share a little bit about my experience gamifying things. So I realize, and a lot of times when I talk to educators about this and their journey of using gamification or game-based learning, they were doing it already before they knew there was a term for it. And I was in a similar situation. So I was using it my first year teaching. And then from there, I've kind of developed into that's really integrated into who I am as an instructor and a teacher and an educator. So I've done everything from gamifying just a lesson to gamifying an entire semester through gamification techniques.
Awesome. And I just want to wish a sincere congrats on kind of balancing out the experiences. But also, you said we have some similar missions, and that's just amazing, because let's have the tide raise all the ships, right? And we're all in this together, and that's why I love connecting like this. And by the way, if you are watching this either live or afterwards, make sure to make a comment in the chat so we can connect with you, to Dustin and to myself. But if you're here live, as Dustin's going to be giving this talk here in a second, feel free to drop some comments as we're going. Some of you submitted comments in advance that Dustin's already been prepped with. And so, Dustin, ready to for me to turn over the show to you?
Awesome. Yeah, sounds good.
All right, take it away.
Cool. So I'm gonna just kind of talk about gamification and game-based learning on this spectrum. So as I go through gamification and using gamification techniques, I'm gonna be referring to the spectrum a little bit. So there's one end of the spectrum, which is all the way in the deep end. So that's gamifying everything from content to grades to classroom management, everything, to dipping your toe in, where that is just maybe using a core mechanic that is important throughout your semester. So an example of this might be like an event deck. So event decks are something that are used in tabletop games a lot, and that's what you might create an event deck, and to start each class you might draw a card from the event deck, and this creates a story that you are developing throughout the course of the semester. So that's kind of the spectrum, all the way in the deep end to this core mechanic, and also you could just gamify a lesson or gamify a unit. So you don't have to necessarily gamify the entire semester. It can be a segment of your learning. Um, so from there, I'm going to go through some of my experiences with gamifying different content or my classroom and semesters and how I've done that. And through that, I'll share some examples of what you could do and maybe hopefully provide some insights and give you some ideas for your learning environment. So I mentioned I was first using tabletop games or gamification before I knew there was a term for it. Sorry, I want to pull up a timer just so I know where I'm at on time. All right. So the first time I used gamification, I've shared this story a lot on my podcast and when I'm a guest because I think it's a really solid example of using gamification, a really solid example of using it to more on that dipping your toe in end where you're not getting all in on gamification. So I had a challenge with some students my first year teaching. I was in a classroom, about 9 or 10 students, and most of them were boys. I think I had one girl or two girls in that classroom. I think maybe one, but then like one would come to class every once in a while. So this was part of a what we call cram schools in Asia. So it's an after school program, but it's very content focused. So it was for learning English. Um, and I had a challenge with these students my first year teaching. I was trying to figure out how I can better manage the behavior in my classroom. And so I decided to kind of do some research online. And at the time, there wasn't a lot of gamification like ideas out there. And when you look up games for ESL, there's a lot of like roll and write games, which are, if you're not familiar with that, that's rolling the dice, moving on a board, answering a question. So I was trying to think of kind of ways outside of the box how I could manage this behavior in my class and integrate some sort of game. And so Avengers was super popular at the time. And what I did is I used Avengers in my classroom and I broke the class up into different groups. And each group got to choose, they were able to choose an Avenger. So their group played as an Avenger in class. And what the Avengers did is they moved across this board. So I had drawn a board out in the front of my class. And if they answered a question correctly, or I wanted to highlight a group because they're working well, I would move their Avenger across the board. And the goal was for their group's Avenger to be the first one across the board to fight Loki. Shout out to Loki because the Disney Plus episode, I think the show started today or last night at midnight. So he was the bad guy back then. So you wanted to get to the end of the board to be able to beat Loki. And then when you beat Loki at the end of class, whatever group beats him, they get some extra bonus stars, which is another classroom management system the whole school used as a school culture. They used the star system. Um, so they received these bonus stars if they were the group that made it to Loki. So when I was doing this, I had to think about what behaviors I wanted to encourage in class, and I wanted to be sure I wasn't taking away positive things that were happening. So when a student was completing something or doing something in a positive way, I didn't want to say, "Okay, now you're doing something that you shouldn't be doing. Now I'm going to take your Avenger back." Um, so I chose an Avenger. So I was the leftover Avenger. Whoever did not, or whatever Avenger was left over, I was that one. I think Hawkeye was not very popular at that time, so a lot of times I was Hawkeye, um, and then or Black Widow too, because again, there were I think that maybe the girls chose the Black Widow, so maybe I wasn't Black Widow, maybe I was Hawkeye. So when there was behaviors in the classes that I wanted to discourage, my Avenger would move across the board, and so it created this collaborative experience in the classroom of the groups versus the teacher, and then this competitive experience of the groups versus each other. So that was my first ever time gamifying something before I even knew what gamification was, before I even knew it was a thing. Um, so from there, I kind of sprinkled in games here and there as part of English language teaching, or I worked in an after school program. For that, it was a lot of more just one-on-one tutoring, so I didn't really have a lot of opportunity to bring in games. We played games after we finished our tutoring, so that was really awesome. Um, but then when I started thinking about using tabletop games in my classroom, and then I had one summer in Taiwan when I was teaching at a university there, and I would suggest this is a perfect time this summer. If you're not teaching and you don't have summer classes, this is a perfect time to kind of start preparing and thinking about how to gamify a semester, especially if you're thinking about that deep end approach. You do need a lot of time to think this through. Um, I had that summer off, and another great thing about teaching in Asia is summers are about as long as winters. So we would get a long winter break and a long summer break. So I always had that time to kind of recharge and also refocus on my content for the upcoming semester. So I decided I wanted to gamify a semester because I was using a lot of game-based learning through English language teaching, and I wanted to see what we could do with gamifying the class and seeing if that could help encourage students um, come to class. So come to class and come to class in time. Encourage that participation in the classroom. One challenge. So this is something to always keep in mind as your student demographic. One challenge I ran into, and a lot of teachers in Taiwan ran into, is a discouragement of learning English language in the classroom or in Taiwan. Um, so I wanted to create a way to maybe hopefully encourage that even more. So I was very I was very popular, not to toot my own horn, in Taiwan on student surveys because I think because of my use of game based learning and maybe some other things too. But I wanted to kind of lean into this more, and um, so I decided I was going to gamify my entire semester, and I wanted to look at this. Well, what components of the learning environment should I gamify, and what components maybe should I not gamify? So I know that there are a lot of resources out there, and maybe I'll have to leave those with Bruce after this. Some links and some books that I kind of looked into. There's like Explore Like a Pirate by Mike. Oh my gosh, I can't remember his last name right now. Um, okay, I'll leave it with Bruce after this. So then going to into that semester, I had to think about what I wanted to gamify and what I did not want to gamify. And a lot of things out there say you can gamify like grades, and I was thinking about doing that, but I didn't really want to gamify games to an extent whereas or grades to extent whereas this really high stakes. So instead I decided I wanted to gamify part of that. I also decided I wanted to encourage things like participation, encourage things like coming to class on time, encourage things like completing work, because that is another challenge I think I had with students is completing work outside of class. So when I was thinking about this, another thing I wanted to think about was gamifying content or ways to reinforce language learning. So I wanted to find a theme that kind of connected both of these goals that I had. And one theme that was really popular and is popular all over the world is Sherlock Holmes. A lot of students have read some of Sherlock Holmes to learn English. So I looked into something called Sherlock Holmes Consulting Detective. And I'm going to share my screen here because I realized I don't know if I was doing some research before this webinar to prepare a little bit, and I don't know if this was available when I did this. I used a different Sherlock Holmes Consulting Detective. It's based on. I'm gonna actually do a quick search because I was just searching it just to show you the other example. So this is there. Asmodee, I don't know. I just found this, so I would recommend maybe checking it out a little bit more. And this is just an example if this is something you want to do. Sherlock Holmes Consulting Detective, you can play it, downloadable print and play right here. I used this one from Game Crafter. And what I had to do, so this is going back to kind of my point, like the summer is a perfect time for this because it does take a lot of work. And this content, this Sherlock Holmes Consulting Detective, the comprehension and the reading level is pretty high. So for my students, I had to rewrite the entire guide and the entire game pretty much uh, for my students' reading level and comprehension level. So I that was part of the work I had to do. Another thing that I wanted to do, I mentioned gamifying behavior to encourage like participation and things like this. So I integrated an XP system, and I'm going to talk more about that when I move on from this semester to what I'm going to talk about next. But the XP system is really important because you don't want to if you're going to reward XP, the XP has to have some sort of meaning. It can't just be points that the students earn. I really like to tie it into different ways or different areas of how I've gamified my content. So with Sherlock Holmes Consulting Detective this semester, I had two ways where I tied in the XP. So the first way was individually. It was part of their um, participation grade. So I came up with an average number of XP points that they can earn for coming to class, completing their work, and coming to class on time, and averaged that out throughout the semester and created a chart for students based on what level they should be to receive like 100% participation, 90%, 80%, and so on. So uh, that is one thing that takes a lot of number crunching, a lot of work to kind of figure out. You need to spend some time on figuring that out, but you don't need to gamify grades. But if you do, really consider the implications that that might be, and be willing. So I had to change my chart at the end of the semester. Be willing to be flexible with it, because again, this is not you're not gamifying to punish your students. You're gamifying to encourage certain behaviors. And I had seen that some students, maybe students overall, were not earning as many points as I thought they had would have earned, even with doing all the things that I wanted to encourage. So I changed my chart at the end of the semester, or actually towards the end. Another thing I gamified was the detective group. So, kind of how detective Sherlock Holmes Consulting Detective works. You receive a mystery, and you're competing against Sherlock Holmes. And in that mystery, there are maybe different suspects or different areas that have came up when you get the short introduction to the mystery. And in the game, there's a huge map of London. I think maybe I can pull up this map actually. Let's see if it loads here. Yeah. So this is really cool. Um, you create a huge map of London, and you can see that there are numbers on here. And essentially, you get the introduction to the case, and you can decide what area on London you want to go to. Um, so in the game, you get your introduction. You decide, okay, where do I want to go investigate more about this crime? Where can I discover more clues? So I split my class up into detective groups, or they chose their groups, and as they earn XP, they unlocked clues. So they unlocked their ability to go to explore different areas in London or talk to different people in the city. And so they would send me an email and tell me, I want to explore 85. And I would have a link to my PowerPoint, or not my power. Yeah, it was actually a PowerPoint slide to 85, and I rewrote what they found at 85 for them. So I had this all prepared pretty much before the semester started. So that kind of bit me in the end, is I didn't finish everything. So I kind of had to rush, and it was kind of some extra work. So learning from my mistakes, try to prepare everything before the semester starts, because you will need to make changes. Especially if this is your first time, you will have to make some changes to what you're doing. So try to prepare as much as you can before. Um, so that was the two ways we kind of gamified that semester. And just to kind of give some more context to that, this was before teaching online was a huge thing. I flipped my classroom, so a lot of the learning was online, and it was a writing class. So I had a lot of one-on-one time with students, and they also worked in peer groups with their writing too. So Sherlock Holmes Consulting Detective was this bonus thing that they had that they could always work on if they felt like their writing was good, or if I like gave them an okay for this week's essay. Um, they could go try to explore the city a little bit, or think about their case. Um, so I'm gonna see how I'm doing on time. Okay, I'm gonna move into just maybe for just a couple minutes. Talk about this. This is Worlds XP. I'm gonna share my screen here again. Um, so Worlds XP is where I went from after the Sherlock Holmes Consulting Detective. We did this for a year. I did 2 separate semesters, and then we went into my wife's classroom, and I took what I learned from Sherlock Holmes Consulting Detective, and I wanted to create something that was available for all teachers to use, a streamlined gamification kit to pick and choose what they want to do to gamify their learning environment. So we went into my wife's classroom. Again, we tied XP into different things like ownership for their learning environment. So as they unlocked a certain level in their XP, they took on a job. So now they're always responsible for this job in the classroom. And they got to choose what job they wanted to do. That's really important too, is you want to give your students that choice. You don't want to ever force them to do anything in a gamified or you, I mean, as a teacher, you are forcing them to do things because you want them to learn, right? But you kind of want to make sure it's not seemed like it's forced. So you want to give them choices as much as possible for things like that. Um, so this toolkit is something that you can use to gamify your semester or your learning environment. It is really meant for in person, and that's why it's been put on the back burner for the last like year and a half. Um, and I'm always happy if anyone is interested. So again, maybe I'll talk to Bruce, or you can reach out to me. I'll leave my email here at the end. I'm always happy to give it to anyone that is willing to provide some feedback and or testimony about the kit. So with this kit, there's a lot of different things involved with it, including different components, cards, XP cards. So another thing that we use with the XP is they get to unlock items. Again, going back to, you don't want to take away something they've achieved, something your student has achieved. So they unlock items. And we have some items I'm going to pull up. I think I have right here. Oh no, I closed out of it. So some items that we had are, one example is a future goggles. So my wife had a reading and writing diary. So they would have to read something and then write about it in their diary. So instead of having to read something, they could watch a show on Netflix and write about it. So that was an item they can unlock. So instead of reading for their diary this week, they could write, or instead of reading, they can watch something and write about it. So then from after taking this into my wife's classroom, we kind of developed this kit, different ways to track experience, different ways to create a narrative stream from beginning of the semester to the end of the semester, where students choose and create characters and they go on this narrative adventure that we talk about how you can tie that into learning outcomes as well. But this is kind of a lot. I don't want to go over this too much. I do want to share a couple examples of game mechanics that you can consider doing that are just maybe closer to the dip your toe into the water instead of the deep end. One thing that I've developed and we used in my wife's classroom at the end of the semester is a deck building review. So if you're familiar with deck builders, or if you're not, a deck builder is something where you acquire cards and you create a deck out of your cards, and you draw maybe 5 cards, and those 5 cards create things you can do. So we created a deck building review game where groups acquired a deck. They built their deck by completing questions on a review sheet, and then they used that deck to fight a boss at the end as a class. You can also use character building and world building. So that's something we did in the World's XP. I mentioned event decks. So I'm kind of jealous of history teachers sometimes, but what's really cool about gamification is you can create cross-curricular content. If you are teaching maybe math, you can have an event deck based off this math historian that goes on these different, has to solve these different puzzles throughout the semester. What's really cool, William Brown, he is the Hungry Gamer. We will be releasing a podcast episode with him very soon. He used this vampire game for his writing class. And essentially the students created a story based off this event deck mechanic, which is, really cool what he shares and what he talks about. And maybe I'll leave it there because I do have a couple other examples, but we'll leave it maybe for questions, because one of the examples has to do with one of the questions too. So we'll leave it for there.
Well, first of all, Dustin, thank you. And you've been doing some great stuff literally around the world in terms of this in different classrooms. And I don't think anybody who's watching this is surprised that you're rated was a very popular teacher in those classrooms. And so the first question I'm going to pose to you, it was one that was sent in advance. And the question is, I'm teaching a quarterly course at a community college. My course is asynchronous, and I want to create a more dynamic, gamified experience. What do I need to keep in mind as I proceed?
Awesome. Yeah. So I was kind of thinking about this one. It's hard to give like specific, uh, I guess a specific answer because I'm not familiar with exactly what the content is, the learning outcomes, and the goals of the course. Um, so I kind of wrote some notes as far as like how to address this or how to think about this, and maybe an example that is just pulled out of thin air based on what I think the course might be about. But maybe you can take something from it. So you want to think about the overarching theme to how you will gamify it, and if you are going to tie in content to learning outcomes at all, or if you're just looking for a way to create an interactive experience that is maybe lacking in synchronous or in-person learning. So think about like what is that goal of gamifying it? Is it to tie in content? Is it to create stronger relationships with your students or students with students and students? So I kind of have an example, and again, I'm pulling this out of thin air, basing it on just an example of an asynchronous course. Um, so maybe you're teaching a course on how to do research, and I'm assuming maybe there might be a discussion board on the course, and there's probably video content that you've created too. So one thing you can do is um, create a character for the class, and that character has missions that the students need to go on each week or every other week or so on. And those missions unlock a larger story for that character. So that's one thing you could do, maybe. Also, um, let's see, I had another example. So one thing that I did with my course when I flipped my classroom was add in like little Easter eggs into my video lesson. So I would add an Easter egg. I would have my original, like my content that they need to learn. And I would cut through it halfway through the video. And one thing I did at the very beginning of the semester is like, I really love coffee. Let me know that I like coffee next time you see me, and I'll give you some extra XP. And then I went back to the content. So that's really great because then I can see who's actually watching my videos. And also it's just kind of a fun thing that students are like, wait, what's going on? Like then they have to readjust and like really make sure they're paying attention to what we're talking about in the video. So those are just a couple examples for that question.
And I think that's great. And I honestly akin that to kind of like when you were to see a synchronous professor or teacher in the real world, kind of breaks that fourth wall of like, oh, they do exist.
Yeah.
That's wonderful. And if anybody else has any thoughts or like particular content areas, feel free to drop that in the chat. But I want to pull in this little quote from Dave, if you wouldn't mind. And the quote is, prioritizing what you want to game is as important as how you plan on doing it. And I'm curious your thoughts on that based on your experiences and maybe some recommendations of how do you balance that?
Yeah, that's super important because I think Dave and I are pretty aware that because Dave he's at University XP and he talks about this a lot too. There's so much you can do with gamification and game based learning, but I think I would almost, say that what you want to prioritize is probably more important than how. Maybe it's close, but yeah, because going back to my example of using Sherlock Holmes in the XP, I I didn't want to prioritize. Uh, I wanted to prioritize participation, coming to class. Like that is, as a teacher and teaching English, my philosophy is about trying and failing and doing it and just trying, and not so much doing it well the first time. And so I wanted to think about also my philosophy as a teacher and what kind of learning environment I want to encourage. And I want to encourage that mentality of showing up and doing it, and not necessarily having to be perfect. Because a lot of language teachers, a lot of teachers probably know that we have to fail. We have to fail a lot, especially in language learning. Or if we're not failing, we are not learning. We cannot become a better language learner if we're not failing. So.
And I thank you for that. And I think you hit on a touchstone of what it means to be an educator and to work in some of these environments. And that is we are also learning in the process, right? And so you talked about a couple different designs you might do. You might do it on particular content. You might do it on a module. You might do it for the whole semester or even year. But you also talked about focusing on what kind of outcomes you want, because you might just want that engagement with people in the class or across the class, or maybe engagement in a topic, or even then the learning outcomes, particular, like, so just varying levels of outcomes that you can design. And you just mentioned about kind of failing, and I would encourage like failing fast, like the faster you can do that. But I'm curious to hear from you, if this is a person who's watching this and is like, okay, I want to do this, and you talked a little bit about this, but just kind of round it all out. What would you recommend? Where should they start? They have a passion for this. They're like, Dustin just inspired me to do it. What should they do following this video?
Oh man, that's a good question. I think it really depends on where they are in their journey. So if you have, like, if you're in the research phase, for me, what really helped was planning and kind of like creating what I wanted to do for my semester while I was also learning about gamification and game-based learning from other experts, because that really, really gives you examples and ideas for how you might do it in your classroom. So I was like consuming a lot of podcasts. I was reading books, um, and I think that really helps. Is just kind of learning from others who have done it, because you will probably take some of the stuff they're doing and make it your own. And also, it kind of gives you that step in the right direction.
And that's just, I feel like, an amazing way to end this. And that kind of full circles this whole talk of, we're all in this together, right? And Dustin, I want to say thank you for coming on here and sharing from your experience. But this shouldn't really be the end of these conversations. So if you were inspired at all by anything Dustin said or about this kind of content, first of all, feel free to reach out to either of us. Dustin's email's in the chat. My email is bruce@tabletopalliance.org, and you can find out a whole bunch of different resources on our site. But Dustin, for how can people get more in contact with your work and things like that? If you wouldn't mind to share that, and then I'll close this out.
Yeah, for sure. So my email, podcast@boardgamewitheducation.com. That's the best way to reach me. I'm Board Game with Education is on all the social media. I'm not excellent at prioritizing getting back to those things. So email is the best way to reach me. I mean, you can always comment on things that we're doing. And I love to hear from people to just, move this mission forward too.
Well, thank you so much, Dustin, for being here today. I know you actually mentioned to me you've got some in-person trainings this afternoon, and so I'm going to let you go off to those, but we look forward to connecting more soon. But thank you again for being here. And so if you were inspired by this at all, please let us know. Please drop something in the chat. If you took something away, we're curious what that lesson is that you are personally taking away. Please drop that in the chat. But we also look forward to connecting with you. And so if you want to learn more about the nonprofit work we're doing, you can head on over to tabletopalliance.org. If you want to attend another upcoming webinar, we've got one coming up at the end of June. And that is going to be with Dylan Wagner of Ball State University, who's going to be talking about how he took and designed an escape room to foster learning about career development. So you don't necessarily need to even be talking about career development, but maybe you're like, I've wanted to make an escape room for my class. Dylan's going to be going over that kind of content, and he's been using it for these little leadership education sessions. And so I just want to say thank you so much for attending today. And if you want to learn more and engage, remember tabletopalliance.org. We're a 501c3 nonprofit, and we look forward to seeing the fruits of all the great labor that you're going to do to gamify and upgrade your classrooms and community programs. So until next time.